Hello, everyone. Today we are going to read the text, The Life of George Washington, and then we will read some questions. George Washington is known as the father of our country. He led our country in a war called the American Revolution. After the war, he became the first president of the United States. Many events in his life led to his success. When George Washington was a boy, there was no United States. There were 13 British colonies. These colonies had very few towns. Most of the people lived on farms, which were called plantations. George Washington was born on a plantation in Virginia. At that time, there were few schools and book learning was not considered important. People needed to know how to manage farms, keep simple records, and how to participate in society and affairs in the colony. George's family hired a teacher for him for a while and later sent him to a local school. He learned to spell, read, and do simple math. He became interested in surveying when he was a teenager. A surveyor is someone who determines boundaries of land. He practiced surveying his home, Mount Vernon. One of his neighbors, Sir Thomas Fairfax, hired him to survey the land he owned west of the Blue Ridge Mountains. He was only 16 years old. Washington and one of his friends spent several months exploring and surveying the land. He learned a lot about the land beyond the mountains. He also learned to survive in the wilderness. This trip helped him learn to be independent. Later, George Washington went with the British Army to fight the French in Ohio. At the age of 19, he became a major in the British Army. During this time, he learned the skills of a soldier. He learned how to fight battles and how to lead men in battle. He became a respected military leader. Later in Washington's life, the American colonies wanted to be free from British rule. When the colonies needed a military leader, they called upon George Washington. He became the commander in chief of the small American army. He led his group of untrained men to victory over the British. The American Revolution lasted 8 years. After the war, Washington was elected the first president of the United States. Even though America was now a country, it still had a lot of problems. Washington was again able to lead the country and help it become stronger. He was president for 8 years. When his term as president was over, Washington returned to Mount Vernon. His wish was to run his plantation and enjoy life on the land he loved. On December 12th, 1799, he became ill while riding through the fields at Mount Vernon and died 2 days later. He died knowing that he had helped make the United States of America an independent country. Other facts about George Washington: he did not go to college, wanted to be a sailor when he was young, married Martha Custis, had two stepchildren, helped design Washington, D.C., never lived in the White House, became President of the United States at 57. Now for the questions. Question number 1. What is similar about paragraphs 2, 3, and 4? Please note that there are numbers beside the paragraphs so you can compare them. A, they describe that George Washington did as an old man. B, they describe how George Washington became a good leader. C, they describe how long George Washington worked to become a surveyor. Or D, they describe why George Washington became the first president of the United States. Number 2, how are paragraphs 3 and 7 similar? A. Both describe George Washington's interest in writing. B. Both describe George Washington's interest in surveying. C. Both describe George Washington's life in Mount Vernon. D. Both describe George Washington's life in Washington, D.C. Number 3. How are paragraphs 5 and 6 similar? A. Both describe how George Washington won the American Revolution. B. Both are about George Washington as a military leader. C. Both are about George Washington's life as president. D. Both describe how George Washington helped America. Number 4. Which sentence from the text supports the first sentence in paragraph 1? George Washington is known as the father of our country. A. Washington and one of his friends spent several months exploring and surveying the land. B. He also learned to survive in the wilderness. C. Washington was again able to lead the country and help it become stronger. D. His wish was to run his plantation and enjoying life on the land he loved. Number 5. What is the relationship between these sentences from paragraph 3? One of his neighbors, Sir Thomas Fairfax, hired him to survey the land he owned west of the Blue Ridge Mountains. And his trip helped him learn to be independent. A. The second sentence describes an effect of the first sentence. B. The second sentence describes a solution to the first sentence. C. The second sentence describes the order of something from the first sentence. Or D. The second sentence describes an example of something given in the first sentence. Number 6. How are paragraphs 2 and 3 similar? A. They tell about George Washington's life after he was president. B. They tell about George Washington's life before he was president. C. They inform the reader about George Washington's interest in school. Or D. They inform the reader about George Washington's interest in surveying. This is the end. Please check your answers, then submit your answers.